It was the single bloodiest siege in modern history, a battle that consumed over 100,000 lives. This was not the Somme. This was not Verdun. This was Port Arthur, 1904. A full decade before the world descended into the Great War, this fortress on the edge of China became a horrific laboratory for the industrial slaughter that would come to define the 20th century. Here, the last echoes of 19th century tactics, massed infantry charges, and the cult of the bayonet collided headlong with the concrete, a barbed wire, and machine guns of a new, pitiless era of warfare. The world saw it as a stunning victory for a rising Japan against a European giant. But the official stories, the tales of peerless Bushido spirit, concealed a brutal truth. The victory at Port Arthur was not the triumph it appeared to be. It was a terrifying preview of a new kind of hell, bought with a currency of blood so high it nearly bankrupted the victor. To understand the First World War, you must first understand this siege. And you must watch until the end to discover the devastating secret that lay buried with the men in its trenches. It is August 19th, 1904. A sea of Japanese infantry, a tens of thousands strong, prepares for a general assault. Their commander, General Nogi, is a man of the 19th century, a warrior forged in the samurai traditions of the old shogunate. He trusts in the Nikudan Kogekyo, the human bullet attack. He believes the superior martial spirit of his men, their Yamato Damashii, can overcome any physical barrier. This is his fatal mistake. The barrier they face is not a medieval wall. It is the dawn of industrial war. H. The order is given, bugles sound, and the waves of infantry surge forward, bayonets fixed, moving at a run toward the Russian redoubts. And then, the 20th century answers to us. From concrete reinforced bunkers, the Russian Maxim guns open up. It is a sound the Japanese have never truly comprehended. Not a rattle of individual shots, but a sustained, mechanical roar that scythes through the air. Men in the SAS front ranks don't just fall. They are physically shredded, dissolving into red mist. The following ranks stumble over them, only to be cut down in turn. They reach the first obstacle, a dense web of barbed wire, staked deep into the earth. As soldiers try to cut their way through, they become hopelessly entangled, easy targets for the machine guns and rapid-firing artillery. But the Russians had added a new, invisible horror. Parts of the wire were electrified, fed by the fortress's generators. Men are vaporized in bright blue flashes, their bodies left smoking on the wire, a gruesome warning to those behind them. The assault, planned as a decisive spiritual victory, grinds to a halt in a matter of hours. It is a slaughterhouse. The slopes of the fortress are slick with blood and piled high with the dead. The human wave has broken against a wall of steel, a wire, and electricity. How did it come to this? How did Japan, a nation that prided itself on meticulous planning, find itself trapped in this futile, bloody nightmare? To understand the trap, we must first understand the mind of the men who set it, and the desperate clock they were racing against. The siege of Port Arthur was not a chess match. It was a demolition job run by a crew that was about to be crushed by a collapsing building. The building was the entire Russian Empire. The demolition was the destruction of its Pacific fleet, and the collapse was the imminent arrival of Russia's Baltic fleet, sailing 18,000 nautical miles from Europe to annihilate the Japanese Navy and sever Japan's lifeline to the continent. The entire Russo-Japanese War, Japan's gamble for survival as an imperial power, hinged on this single, desperate race against time. Time 1.5's Rand. When we analyze the strategic situation, the logic becomes brutally clear. The war began in February 1904 with a daring Japanese torpedo attack that crippled the Russian Pacific Fleet and bottled it up inside Port Arthur's harbor. But crippled was not destroyed. As long as that fleet existed, even at anchor, it posed a mortal threat. Admiral Togo's navy could blockade the port, but he could not sail in to finish the job. He would be torn apart by the fortress's massive 10-inch coastal guns. The fleet was safe, nestled behind one of the most formidable defensive networks on Earth. This is where the Japanese master plan took shape, a two-pronged strategy dictated by absolute necessity. The Navy would hold the blockade, a cork in the bottle. The Army, specifically the Third Army under General Nogi, was tasked with capturing the fortress from the landward side. This was the only way. But the initial assaults, like the one we saw in August, were based on a catastrophic miscalculation. Believing the fortress's landward side was weaker, and driven by the urgent need for a quick victory, Nogi threw his men against its main defense line. He was wrong. The Russians had spent years perfecting a layered defense of interlocking artillery, deep trenches, and the new, horrific Maxim machine gun. Then came the news that changed everything. The Tsar, enraged by the initial defeats, had dispatched the Baltic fleet. The clock was now ticking audibly. Japanese high command calculated it would take the fleet roughly 7 months to make the journey. Nogi no longer had the luxury of a methodical siege. He had to take the fortress now. This pressure explains the psychology of command. It drove the seemingly insane human bullet tactics. They were the desperate gambles of a man who believed he was trading lives for time, the one resource he could not afford to lose. But the true Japanese strategy, the master plan being deconstructed at such cost, was more subtle. They did not need to capture the entire fortress. They needed to capture one specific point within it. The Russian fleet was hiding behind the hills, invisible to Japanese naval guns and most of their land artillery. The plan, therefore, was not to conquer the city, but to seize a sniper's perch. They needed to capture a high point, any high point, that had a direct line of sight into the harbor. Once they had it, they would perform the Herculean task of dragging their own secret weapon, massive 11-inch, 280 meters siege howitzers, to the summit. From there, these guns would act as mortars, lobbing armor-piercing shells on a high arc over the protective hills and straight down onto the decks of the Russian battleships. The entire, bloody, grinding sieging, every trench dug, every charge, every man sacrificed, was ultimately a fight for a single artillery observation post. By late November 1904, the siege had become a primal struggle of mud, blood, and ice. The main fortress lines remained unbroken. General Nogi, and his reputation in tatters, and 2 of his own sons, already killed in the futile assaults, finally turned his entire focus to the one objective that mattered, a barren, anonymous mound of earth designated 203-meter hill. It was not the highest point, nor the most fortified, but it held the one thing the Japanese Third Army would sacrifice everything for: a perfect, unobstructed view of the Russian fleet at anchor. The Russians, under the command of the battle-hardened General Kondratenko, knew its value. They had turned the hill into a fortress in miniature, a labyrinth of deep trenches, sandbagged machine gun nests, and hidden mortar pits, all connected by tunnels. The psychological tension was unbearable. For the Japanese, this was the final gamble. The Baltic Fleet was already rounding Africa. Failure here meant the failure of the entire war. For the Russians, huddling in frozen trenches, suffering from scurvy and dwindling ammunition, it was a fight to the death. The assault began on November 28th. This was not a human bullet charge. It was a methodical, a desperate crawl. The Japanese first unleashed a thunderous, a day-long artillery barrage. Their own 11-inch howitzers, which they had dragged for weeks over mountains, pounded the summit. The very geology of the hill was transformed, its crest vanishing in a permanent cloud of smoke and pulverized rock. Then, the infantry went in, not in waves, but in small but determined units, crawling from shell crater to shell crater. The fighting was medieval in its intimacy and industrial in its lethality. It was a battle fought with bayonets or trench clubs and sharpened spades in a landscape of shattered tree stumps and frozen, unburied bodies. The Maxim guns chattered relentlessly. The Russians, masters of defense, rolled grenades and makeshift bombs down the slopes into the packed Japanese ranks. Entire companies were annihilated trying to cross a few yards of open ground. The Japanese would gain a trench line, only to be thrown out hours later by a savage Russian counterattack. For 5 days, the summit of 203-meter hill changed hands 9 times. It was a vortex of slaughter. The sources describe men fighting for hours, knee-deep in a slurry of snow, mud, and the remains of their comrades. But the Japanese, fueled by a fatalistic desperation, kept coming. Nogi fed fresh battalions into the meat grinder, replacing the dead with more dead. Finally, on December 5th, after a titanic final artillery bombardment and an all-out assault, a small group of Japanese soldiers secured the western crest. They were joined by others, and by nightfall, the hill was theirs. The cost was apocalyptic. Japan had lost over 8,000 men in 1 week on one hill. The Russians lost nearly 6. Attack on defending it. Mias. But the victory was immediate and decisive. As the smoke cleared on December 6th, Japanese artillery observers crawled to the summit, unspooled their telephone wires, and looked down. There, like fish in a pond, lay the entire Russian Pacific Fleet. The coordinates were called down. The 11-inch howitzers, silent until now, adjusted their aim. The first 500-pound shell arced high into the sky, falling almost silently and smashed through the deck of the battleship Poltava. One by one, the fleet was systematically destroyed at its moorings. The race against time was over. The back of the Russian war effort was broken. It is tempting to look at the fall of Port Arthur as a triumph of the Japanese warrior spirit, a validation of the Bushido Code. This is the great myth of the siege, a narrative of heroic sacrifice that was carefully cultivated for propaganda. But when we analyze the cold, hard data, the sources tell a very different story. The human bullet attacks, which cost General Nogi tens of thousands of lives, were not a strategy. They were a horrific miscalculation. The victory was not won by the bayonet, but by the 11-inch siege, howitzer dot. The decisive factor was not spiritual superiority, but the eventual, desperate triumph of industrial age artillery over 19th century tactics. The psychological pressure on General Nogi Muresuke was immense. He was a man of the old world, a samurai at heart, who saw the frontal assault as a test of will. He fundamentally misunderstood the weapons arrayed against him. The Maxim gun was not just another weapon. It was a force of nature that rendered courage irrelevant. For months, Nogi hurled his men against this wall of steel, driven by the ticking clock of the Baltic Fleet. He was desperate, and his desperation was compounded by a personal sense of honor that demanded a direct, and therefore bloody, solution. The sources show that it was only after his repeated, catastrophic failures and the quiet, forceful intervention of his chief of staff, General Kodama Gentarov, that the strategy shifted. The focus was forced away from capturing the main fortress and onto the true objective, 203-meter hill Tien-Sans. This one was the real strategic deconstruction. The battle was won not by Nogi's initial plan, but by its abandonment. The decisive factors were twofold. First, the Russian defense, which was a terrifyingly modern blueprint of trenches or barbed wire and interlocking machine gun fire, the very formula that would dominate the Western Front. And second, Japan's own technological trump card, the massive 280 medium howitzers. These guns, once given a line of sight by the observers on 203 Hill, were the only tools capable of bypassing the fortress walls and executing the actual missions, the destruction of the fleet. The infantry sacrifices did not win the siege. They only won the piece of land that allowed the artillery to win it. Port Arthur was not Japan's finest hour. It was its bloodiest lesson. The fall of Port Arthur sent a shockwave across the globe. It was the first time in modern history that a non-European power had defeated a European one, and it signaled the emergence of Japan as a world-class military force. Yet the victory's most profound lesson was almost universally ignored. European and American military observers, embedded with both armies, filed their reports. They wrote dutifully of the machine guns, the trenches, the barbed wire, and the devastating power of heavy, high-angle artillery. But in the halls of power in Berlin, Paris, and London, the reports were dismissed. The consensus was that this was a peculiar Asiatic conflict. The suicidal bravery of the Japanese, it was argued, was a cultural anomaly. The incompetence of the Russian command was the real reason for the defeat. They saw the events, but they refused to see the future. And so, the blueprint for the First World War was filed away. A mere decade later, the young officers who had scoffed at the primitive trench digging at Port Arthur would be commanding their own men to go over the top at the Somme, sending them into the same mechanical, industrialized slaughter. The 100,000 lives lost at Port Arthur were a dress rehearsal, or a horrific prophecy that went unheeded. For the victor, General Nogi, the end of the war brought no peace. He was welcomed home as a national hero, the conqueror of Port Arthur. But the man himself was broken. He had lost 2 sons and over 50,000 men under his command, many in charges he knew were futile. Haunted by the cost, he reported directly to Emperor Meiji, and in a tearful audience, begged permission to commit ritual suicide to atone for the lives he had squandered. The emperor refused, commanding him to live as long as he and the emperor did. Nogi obeyed. On September 13th, 1912, the day of Emperor Meiji's funeral, General Nogi and his wife, Shizuko, committed seppuku in their home. It was the last tragic act of a man caught between the samurai world he was born into and the brutal, modern one he had helped create. As a final or little-known fact, the Russian general who surrendered the fortress, Anatoly Stessel, met a very different fate. While Nogi was being celebrated, Stessel was court-martialed in St. Petersburg and sentenced to death for cowardice and for surrendering the fortress too soon. Though his sentence was later commuted, it stands in stark contrast to the tragic, honorable exit of his opponent. The trenches of Port Arthur dug in the frozen mud of Manchuria, were a scar on the face of the earth. But they were also a map to a future of industrial war that Europe, in its arrogance, would have to learn all over again at the cost of millions.